The latch clicked, sharp and final, against the hallway's low hum. Then the door swung inward, and the sensory impact was immediate. The stale, recycled warmth of the corridor collided with the hermetically sealed coolness of her sanctuary. In my hands, the clay pot felt heavy, grounded, a dense weight of damp earth and dormant life pressing against my palms. I adjusted my grip on the night-blooming jasmine, feeling the rough texture of the terracotta. It wasn't blooming yet. That was the point. She stood framed in the doorway, a silhouette cut from the city light bleeding in behind her. She wasn't wearing the armor I saw on the magazine covers. This was different. This wasn't a delivery. It was an entry. I stepped across the threshold, and the silence hit me like a physical wave. Her apartment was less a home and more a gallery of absence. White walls, white floors, furniture that looked like it had been sculpted from ice rather than wood. It smelled of nothing, aggressively so. Just ozone, filtered air, and expensive, unscented cleaner. I, on the other hand, was a riot of organic noise. I could smell the rain on my canvas jacket, the rich, dark peat moss clinging to my boots, the metallic tang of the shears I'd used an hour ago. I felt suddenly loud, a rough draft in a room full of final prints. I shifted the pot again. My fingernails still held the ghost of the soil I'd repotted this jasmine in. It felt like a transgression, bringing something so messy, so deeply alive, into a space so determined to be static. She watched me. She had shed the public skin she wore for the cameras. No heavy contour, no architectural hair sprayed into submission. Just her, in loose silk that hung off the sharp angles of her shoulders, her face scrubbed clean and looking younger, more dangerous in its exhaustion. She looked at the plant, then at my hands, stained and working class, then finally at my eyes. Her gaze was steady, practiced, but there was a flicker of something else behind it. A question. Or maybe a challenge. "I didn't think you'd bring it yourself," she said. Her voice was low, stripped of the bright, artificial cadence she used in interviews. It was a midnight voice, raspy and real. "It's a delicate specimen," I replied, my voice sounding too deep in the empty room. "It requires specific handling. I don't trust couriers with things that only open in the dark." The words hung there, suspended in the cool air. It was a polite exchange on the surface, a transaction, florist to client, service provider to star. But the subtext was a live wire running between us, humming with a frequency only we could hear. I wasn't leaving. She wasn't asking me to. The air thickened, charged with the realization that the transaction had ended the moment she opened the door, and something else had begun, a negotiation of space. She stepped back, leaving the door wide open, a silent invitation that felt louder than a shout. "Well," she said, turning slightly, exposing the long, elegant line of her neck. "You better bring it in then, before it gets cold." I watched her walk deeper into the apartment. She moved with a liquid grace that couldn't be taught, only honed through years of scrutiny. But there was a heaviness to it tonight, a drag in her step that spoke of 12-hour shoots and the crushing weight of being looked at but never seen. I kicked the door shut behind me with my heel. The sound was a definitive thud that sealed us in. The living room was vast and shadowed, lit only by the ambient glow of the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling glass. It felt like standing inside a camera lens, waiting for the shutter to click. I carried the jasmine like an offering, or perhaps a weapon. I wasn't sure which yet. I felt the heat rising in my collar, a slow burn of adrenaline. I was grounded, earthy, real. She was ethereal, distant, polished. But gravity works on everything, and as I walked toward her, closing the distance, I could feel the pull. It was undeniable. A magnetic drag that had nothing to do with botany, and everything to do with the way she paused in the center of the room, waiting for me to catch up. The distance between us felt less like empty space and more like a held breath. I set the clay pot down on the coffee table. It was a slab of clear acrylic, invisible until you touched it. Ghost furniture for a ghost life. The terracotta made a dull, heavy sound against the plastic, a sound of friction, of two worlds grinding together. I began to peel back the brown butcher paper I'd wrapped it in for the transit. The sound was loud, crinkling and tearing in the quiet room, violating the hush she paid so much rent to maintain. I took my time. There is a seduction in the slow reveal, in the deliberate removal of layers. It's something she would understand, intimately, though she usually experienced it from the other side of the lens. The paper fell away, pooling on the glass like shed skin. The plant emerged. It wasn't a showstopper, not yet. In the harsh reality of an unlit room, the night-blooming jasmine looks almost pedestrian. It's a shrub, really. Green, glossy leaves, lanceolate and simple. The flowers were there, but they were tightly shut. Small, tubular buds of pale green and creamy white, looking more like tiny, closed fists than blossoms. They looked defensive. They looked like secrets kept under extreme pressure.
"It doesn't look like much," she said, her voice drifting over the top of the leaves. She hadn't moved closer yet, staying safely behind the perimeter of the area rug. "That's the deception," I replied, smoothing a bent leaf with my thumb. "This is Cestrum nocturnum. It's not the kind of beauty you're used to. It doesn't scream for attention. It doesn't bloom for the sun, and it doesn't open for an audience." I looked up at her, catching her gaze and holding it. It demands the dark. It hoards its energy all day, looking ordinary, boring even. It waits until the light dies. Only then does it open. It's a survival mechanism. It refuses to perform until the conditions are exactly right. I saw the shift in her posture. The professional boredom cracked. A flicker of genuine interest broke through the exhaustion etched around her eyes. She understood that. She understood the concept of a split existence, the dormant, quiet self, and the one that comes alive when the environment demands it. But for her, the trigger was a flashbulb. For this plant, it was the absence of light. I watched her process the metaphor. In her world, beauty is a demand. It is extracted, refined, retouched, and projected. It is a commodity with an expiration date, measured in seasons and campaigns. Nature has a precision that the fashion industry tries to mimic, but never quite captures. This plant didn't care about trends. It operated on an ancient biological clock. Its beauty was a byproduct of its survival, not its purpose. I wondered if she remembered what that felt like, to exist without being consumed. Her face was a study in controlled fatigue, the high cheekbones catching the dim light, the shadows under her eyes speaking of jet lag and skipped meals. She was a masterpiece of construction, a canvas painted by other people's desires. But standing there, looking at a pot of dirt, I was far more interested in the ruin underneath. She drifted closer. It wasn't a walk. It was a glide, a muscle memory from 1,000 runways. She stopped at the edge of the table, her shins brushing the acrylic. She leaned forward, her hair falling like a curtain around her face, cutting off the rest of the room, narrowing the universe down to just the three of us. Me, her, and the jasmine. The proximity changed the air. I could smell her now. The expensive, sterile scent of the apartment was losing the battle against her own chemistry. Beneath the fading notes of some floral perfume, there was the warm, salty scent of skin, the faint, metallic tang of hairspray, and the heat radiating from a body that had been running on adrenaline for too long. It was the first breach of the perimeter. She was close enough that I could see the texture of her skin, the slight dryness on her lips. "It looks tight," she whispered, reaching out a hand. Her fingers were long, slender. The nails painted a nude shade that matched her skin perfectly. Artificial perfection hovering over organic chaos. "It's waiting," I said, my voice dropping an octave, matching the intimacy of the space she'd created by leaning in. "It knows the sun is setting." The scent of the soil began to rise, earthy and damp, grounding the electric tension in the room. We were standing on the edge of something, waiting for the dark to do its work. She froze. It wasn't the freeze of a frightened animal, but the calculated stillness of a professional. I had been looking at her for perhaps 3 seconds too long, past the polite duration of a service provider, drifting into the territory of something personal. And her body responded with a terrifying, automated efficiency. It happened in the space between heartbeats. Her chin dipped just a fraction of an inch, finding a shadow that sharpened the line of her jaw. Her left shoulder rolled back, accentuating the clavicle, catching the ambient light from the window. Her lips parted, not to speak, but to create a shape that suggested breath, suggested desire, without actually giving anything away. It was a reflex, a defense mechanism honed by a decade of having lenses shoved in her face. When she felt eyes on her, she didn't shrink. She became a composition. She turned herself into two-dimensional art to avoid being a three-dimensional person. It was the architecture of a pose, built instantly to deflect the intimacy of being truly seen. She was offering me the image, the cover shot, because the woman underneath was too tired to handle the scrutiny of a real person standing in her living room. "You're doing it," I said softly. I didn't move my eyes. I kept them locked on the bridge of her nose, refusing to track the enticing line of her neck she had just offered up. She blinked, and for a split second, the composition faltered. "Doing what?" "Curating," I answered. "You're finding the light. You're angling your best side. You're bracing for the shutter click." I took a half step closer, encroaching on the invisible stage she had built. "There is no camera here. You can drop the angle." She let out a breath, a sharp, frustrated sound that was entirely unscripted. The pose collapsed, the shoulders slumped forward, the chin lifted, and suddenly she looked smaller, heavier. "It's habit," she murmured, turning her face away, looking out the window at the darkening skyline. "I don't know how to stop. It's muscle memory. If someone is looking, I have to be worth looking at." "You are a canvas," I observed, keeping my voice neutral, clinical. "That's the job, isn't it? You erase yourself so they can project a fantasy onto you. You become the clothes, the perfume, the lifestyle. But the canvas gets worn out. The texture degrades." She looked back at me, hurt flashing in her eyes. It was raw, honest. "I'm not a canvas," she said, her voice gaining a sudden, sharp edge. "I'm the structure that holds it all up. Do you have any idea how much strength it takes to stay this still? To hold a shape for hours while people pin things to you and paint over you? It's not passive. It's endurance." "I know," I said. "But static beauty is brittle. It breaks if you touch it too hard. That's why you like the flowers, isn't it? They move, they wilt, they die. They have the luxury of inconsistency." I watched the realization hit her. I was dismantling the pedestal she stood on, not to tear her down, but to bring her down to eye level. I wanted the living thing, not the statue. I wanted the mess. "You're staring," she challenged, trying to regain the upper hand, trying to summon the unflinching gaze she used on magazine covers to intimidate the reader. "I am," I admitted. "I'm testing the structural integrity." We stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills. This was the test. In her world, eye contact was a transaction. She gave it to the lens, the photographer took it, the audience consumed it. But here, there was no intermediary. There was no glass, no gloss, no editor to airbrush the hesitation. I held her gaze, refusing to blink, refusing to smooth over the tension with a polite smile or a deferential nod. I forced her to stay in the discomfort of being observed without being captured. The air between us grew heavy, thick with the things we weren't saying. The silence stretched, tight as a violin string waiting to snap. She wanted to look away. I could see the impulse twitching at the corner of her eye, but she was too proud to be the first one to break. So she held it. She endured the proximity, the rawness of it. And in that sustained, unblinking moment, the last of the sunlight finally bled out of the room. The shadows lengthened, stretching from the corners, swallowing the furniture, until the only thing visible was the pale, ghostly reflection of her face in my eyes, and the dark promise of the Jasmine waiting on the table between us. "We can't leave it here," I said, breaking the silence that had stretched too tight. My voice sounded loud in the cavernous room, a blunt instrument against the glass walls. "The draft from the hallway will kill it before midnight. It needs containment. It needs a corner." I gestured to a shadowed alcove near the window, a dead space in the architectural plan that felt like an afterthought. "There, but that console table has to move." She looked at the heavy slab of Italian marble balancing on thin steel legs. It was a piece of sculpture masquerading as furniture, cold and uninviting. "That weighs 300 pounds, she said, her arms crossing defensively over her chest. "I have movers for that." "We don't need movers," I said, stepping around the acrylic table. "We just need leverage." I didn't wait for her permission. I walked to the far end of the console. I didn't look at her. I just waited. It was a gamble. I was betting on her curiosity, on the novelty of physical exertion in a life defined by stillness. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, I heard the soft slide of her bare feet on the polished concrete. She moved to the other end. This was the calibration. The shift from static observation to kinetic cooperation. She gripped the marble, her knuckles white against the dark stone. On the exhale, I instructed, my voice low. Lift. We moved together. The weight was substantial, grounding. It forced a synchronization of effort that conversation never could. We shuffled sideways, crab-walking the heavy table across the room. The space between us was occupied by the stone, but the air above it was a conductor. We were tethered by the burden we shared. Set it down, I said. We lowered it. As the legs hit the floor, her hand slipped. It was a minor loss of friction, a simple physics equation. But the result was anything but simple. Her fingers slid off the edge and brushed the back of my hand. It wasn't a polite graze. It was a collision. Skin against skin. Her cool, manicured smoothness against my rough, weather-beaten warmth. The heat was instantaneous. A flare that had nothing to do with friction and everything to do with the voltage we had been generating since she opened the door. She pulled back sharply, as if she'd touched a hot stove. I didn't move. I stayed in the space she vacated, letting the sensation linger on my skin. Static, she murmured, rubbing her hand against her silk pants, though we both knew the air in here was too conditioned for static electricity. If you say so, I replied, turning my back to her to retrieve the Jasmine. I could feel her eyes on my spine. It was a different kind of weight now. Not the heavy, crushing pressure of a camera lens, but something sharper. Curiosity. Hunger, maybe. I placed the clay pot on the marble. It looked better there. Anchored. Protected. The lights, I said, keeping my focus on the leaves, adjusting their orientation with deliberate care. They're too aggressive. The Jasmine opens for the moon, not for halogen. It needs to think it's alone. I heard the click of a switch behind me. The room plunged into a deeper gray, illuminated only by the amber bleed of the city outside. The shadows stretched, changing the geometry of the room. The ceiling felt lower. The walls felt closer. The vast, empty apartment had suddenly shrunk to a 10-foot radius around this corner. The darkness wasn't an absence of light. It was an addition of intimacy. I turned around. She was standing by the switch, her hands still hovering near the wall. In the dim light, the fatigue was erased, replaced by a softness that the high-definition bulbs had stolen from her. She looked less like a monument and more like a woman, standing in her own living room. She was watching me, really watching me. Usually, she was the one being dissected, her angles studied, her flaws erased. Now, the dynamic had inverted. She was the observer, studying the way my hands moved over the plant, the dirt under my nails, the competence of someone who shapes living things, rather than just looking at them. Better? She asked, her voice softer now, dampened by the shadows. Necessary, I corrected. Now we wait. I leaned against the wall, crossing my arms. I made no move to leave. This was the final adjustment, the necessary intrusion. I was invading her personal time, her private space, and I was doing it with the absolute confidence of someone who knows they are needed. She didn't ask me to go. She walked back toward the circle of intimacy we'd just created, drawn by the gravity of the darkened corner. She stopped 3 feet away, the safety distance. But in the dark, 3 feet feels like 3 inches. You treat the room like you own it, she observed, tilting her head. I treat the room like a habitat, I replied. You live in a showroom. I'm just trying to make it survivable. The silence returned, but it wasn't empty this time. It was calibrated, tuned to the frequency of 2 people breathing in the dark, waiting for something to open. It began imperceptibly. A shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room, a subtle thickening of the air that had nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with chemistry. In the shadowed corner, the Cestrum nocturnum finally woke up. The tightly wound fists of the buds didn't pop. They surrendered. They unfurled with a slow, agonizing deliberation, peeling back their pale green casings to reveal the creamy, star-shaped throats within. And with that opening came the invasion. The scent hit us in waves. It wasn't the polite, sanitized fragrance of a cut rose, or the soapy floral notes of the expensive candles she kept on her mantle but never lit. This was raw. It was heavy, indolic, and deeply narcotic. It smelled of warm honey, of crushed green sap, of sugar left to burn on a stove, and something underneath it all that smelled like skin. It was a nocturnal broadcast, a desperate chemical shout into the dark, designed to attract moths from miles away. In this hermetically sealed glass box of an apartment, it was overwhelming. It filled the vacuum of the room, displacing the sterile ozone, clinging to the curtains, the furniture, and us. She leaned in, drawn by a gravity she couldn't name. I moved with her. The logic of the room had collapsed into this single square yard of space. To experience the bloom, we had to inhabit the same orbit. We stood shoulder to shoulder, the fabric of my canvas jacket brushing the silk of her trousers with a sound like a whisper. We bowed our heads together over the terracotta pot, two worshippers at a very strange altar. "It's intense," she breathed. The word was an understatement. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, letting the heavy, cloying sweetness coat the back of her throat. "It has to be," I murmured, my voice low, barely disturbing the stillness. "It has a narrow window. It has 6 hours to ensure its survival before the sun comes up and burns the scent away. It doesn't have time for subtlety." I watched her profile in the dim amber light. The tension that usually held her face together, the professional rigidity, was dissolving under the influence of the scent. Her lips parted slightly. The air she was pulling into her lungs was the same air I had just exhaled. We were sharing oxygen, recycling the heat between us, trapped in a feedback loop of breath and perfume. The proximity was no longer a negotiation. It was a fact. "It smells like..." She trailed off, searching for a comparison in her visual world and finding none. "Like desire," I finished for her. Like wanting something so badly, you turn yourself inside out to get it. The silence that followed was heavy, weighted down by the truth of the metaphor. I listened to the rhythm of her breathing. At first, it had been shallow, rapid, the breathing of someone waiting for a command. But as the jasmine saturated the air, her rhythm changed. It deepened. It slowed. The jagged edges smoothed out. I adjusted my own breathing, calibrating it until we were inhaling in sync. In, filling our lungs with the heavy, sweet poison of the flower. Out, releasing the tension into the dark. The acoustics of the room shifted. The vast, empty apartment felt gone. The world ended at the perimeter of the rug. In the dark, sound travels differently, or perhaps we just listen with more precision. I could hear the tiny, wet sound of her tongue wetting her lips. I could hear the friction of her hair sliding over her shoulder as she tilted her head toward me. We were standing so close that I could feel the radiant heat of her body, a warm hum against my side. The plant was the excuse, the catalyst, but it was quickly becoming irrelevant. We weren't smelling the jasmine anymore. We were smelling the charged electric air that crackled in the inch of space between her arm and mine. The bloom had done its job. It had lured us into the trap of proximity, and now the trap was springing shut. The botanical excuse was evaporating, leaving us with nothing but the terrifying reality of the body. The temptation was inevitable. I watched it rise in her, a physical impulse fighting against her trained restraint. She wanted to touch it. It was a fundamental human instinct. When we encounter something beautiful and strange in the dark, we want to verify its existence with our hands. We want to possess it, if only for a second, to prove that the scent and the shape aren't just a trick of the light. Her hand drifted up, moving through the heavy, scented air like a swimmer moving through water. It was a slow, hypnotic movement. Her fingers were extended, reaching for the largest cluster of blooms that had just cracked open. She was going for the petals, for the creamy, star-shaped throats that were currently exhaling that thick, narcotic perfume into the room. "Don't," I said. The word was soft, barely a sound, but it stopped her hand in midair. "The oil's on your skin," I explained, my voice a low rumble in the quiet space. "They're acidic to the petals. If you touch the white, it will brown by morning. It bruises if you look at it wrong." I didn't pull my hand back. Instead, I moved it. I reached out and intercepted her wrist just before her fingertips could make contact with the flower.
It wasn't a grab. It wasn't a forceful stop. It was a precise intervention. My fingers wrapped around the delicate bones of her wrist, my thumb resting lightly against the pulse point on the inside of her arm. The contact was electric. It was a sudden, sharp intake of data. Her skin was cool, smooth as the marble we had just moved, but beneath the surface, there was a frantic heat. I didn't let go. Instead, I guided her hand. I moved it away from the vulnerable petals and down toward the leaves, the sturdy, glossy foliage that could handle the weight of human curiosity. "Here," I whispered. "Touch the structure, not the ornament." I guided her fingers to the edge of a leaf. But she didn't touch the plant. She didn't move her fingers to trace the veins of the greenery. She froze. We were linked now, a closed circuit of touch in the semi-darkness. My hand holding hers, suspended over the jasmine. The precision of the grip was professional, a florist guiding a client. But the duration was personal. I felt it then, a tremor. It started in her fingers and traveled down her arm, a subtle vibration that hummed against my palm. It wasn't the shiver of cold. The apartment was temperature controlled to a perfect, sterile 70 degrees. This was the tremor of a wire pulling too tight. It was the physical manifestation of a woman who spends her entire life holding herself together, suddenly finding a crack in the foundation. "You're trembling," I observed. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same clinical detachment I used to discuss soil pH or light exposure. She tried to pull back, just a fraction, but I held the connection. I didn't tighten my grip, but I didn't release it either. I let the silence stretch, heavy and unflinching. "It's the caffeine," she lied. Her voice was thin, brittle. "I haven't eaten." "It's not the caffeine," I said, tracing the line of her tendon with my thumb, a movement so small it was almost invisible, yet it felt like a shout in the quiet room. We were caught in an open loop, the moment before the moment, the precipice where the professional pretext falls away and leaves you standing on the edge of something reckless. The jasmine sat between us, ignored now, its job done. It had lured us into this trap of proximity, and now we were stuck in it. I could feel the rapid staccato of her pulse jumping against my skin. It was a frantic bird, trapped in a cage of ribs and silk. She wasn't afraid of me. She was afraid of the fact that she didn't want to pull away. I watched her eyes. They were wide, the pupils blown out, swallowing the iris, trying to take in the limited light. She was looking at my mouth, then my eyes, then back to the plant, searching for an escape route, searching for the script she was supposed to follow. But there were no cue cards here. There was just the heat of my hand on her wrist and the overwhelming scent of things opening in the dark. Then the tension snapped. Not the connection. She broke that herself. She jerked her hand back, breaking the circuit. The loss of contact was physical, a sudden coldness where her warmth had been. She stepped back, her movement uncoordinated, clumsy for the first time all night. She retreated until her back hit the wall of the alcove with a dull thud. She stood there, pinned against the plaster, chest heaving, eyes wide. She looked like she'd just touched a live wire. In a way, she had. She had touched the reality of being seen, really seen, without the lens to protect her. And for a woman whose entire existence was a performance, that kind of nakedness was terrifying. "I can't," she breathed, the words tumbling out, defensive and panicked. "You can," I replied, not moving, letting the space between us vibrate with the energy she had just released. "You just don't know what happens next." I didn't let her retreat. I didn't let the silence settle into something comfortable or safe. I pressed the advantage, not out of cruelty, but out of a necessary, surgical precision. We had breached the surface, shattered the polite fiction of the transaction, and it was too late to pretend we were still swimming in the shallow end of client relations. "It wasn't the plant," I said. My voice was calm, a stark, grounding contrast to the frantic rhythm of her chest rising and falling against the silk blouse. "I'm tired," she deflected, her eyes darting to the door, to the window, anywhere but my face. She was looking for an exit, for a distraction, for a producer to yell, "Cut." "It's been a long week. I'm not myself." "You are exactly yourself," I corrected, stepping into the space she had just vacated. "That's the problem. You're so used to being a projection, a two-dimensional fantasy, That the moment you have to be a three-dimensional person in a dark room, you panic. What is it? The lack of a script? The fact that I'm not telling you to lift your chin or suck in your stomach? She laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that cracked the heavy atmosphere like cheap glass. You think you know me because you brought me a flower? You think you can psychoanalyze me in 5 minutes because you read a magazine interview? I think I know what it looks like when something is trying to survive in a hostile environment, I said, gesturing to the Jasmine, then to the tight line of her shoulders. I know that you are surrounded by people, from the moment you wake up until the moment you crash. Agents, stylists, directors, fans. You are the most visible woman in the city tonight. I took another step forward, eating up the distance she had tried to put between us, forcing the issue. So tell me, if you're so surrounded, why is the air in here so thin? Why does it feel like you haven't been touched, actually touched, in years? Her expression shattered. It wasn't a dramatic break. It was a subtle fracture in the porcelain, a hairline crack running through the composure she held so dear. Her mouth opened, then closed. The defiance drained out of her posture, leaving her looking incredibly young and devastatingly tired against the stark white wall. They touch me all day, she whispered, the words barely making it across the gap, stripped of all her usual vocal armor. They pin the clothes. They fix the hair. They tilt my head. I am a mannequin. I am a prop. Their hands are cold. They're efficient. They don't feel me. They feel the fabric. They feel the light hitting the cheekbone. And that's why you're shaking, I said softly. Because my hand wasn't efficient. It wasn't fixing anything. It was just there. It was too much, she admitted, her voice trembling, raw and unpolished. It was too heavy. I'm not used to weight. I'm used to surface tension. I'm used to things that float. Surface tension breaks, I said. You need ballast. I moved again. I stepped into the shadow of the alcove. The safety gap was gone. I was close enough to count the eyelashes framing her wide, startled eyes. I was close enough to feel the radiant heat of her embarrassment and her desire mixing in the air between us. Look at me, I commanded. It wasn't a request. She tried to look away, to find the camera, to find the angle, to find the version of herself that knew how to handle this. But there was nowhere to go. She was backed against the wall, and I was the only thing in her field of vision. Don't give me the model, I said, my voice dropping to a register that vibrated in the floorboards. Don't give me the cover girl. I want the woman who is terrified of a jasmine plant. Look at me. She lifted her chin. She stopped fighting the instinct to hide. She locked eyes with me, and for the first time all night, the gaze was truly unflinching. It was raw. It was terrifyingly open. It was an interrogation of the soul, stripped of all the lighting tricks and post-production edits. I see you, I said, holding her gaze, refusing to let her look away, refusing to let her rebuild the wall. I see the exhaustion, and I see that you are starving for something that isn't printed on glossy paper. And what is that? She challenged, though the fight was gone from her voice, replaced by a desperate, dangerous curiosity. Precision, I answered. To be touched by someone who knows exactly what they are holding. The barrier collapsed. I saw it happen physically. Her shoulders dropped, her breath hitched, then released in a long, shuddering sigh. The wall behind her was no longer a trap. It was the only thing holding her up. She didn't move away. She didn't look for the exit. She just stood there, in the dark, waiting. I reached out. It wasn't a sudden movement, nor was it a request. It was a gravitational shift, inevitable and slow, moving through the heavy, scented air that had become a third participant in the room. I bypassed the jasmine, bypassed the safe, neutral territory of the space between us, and crossed the final line of defense. My hand didn't tremble. It moved with the same deliberate care I used for the most fragile blooms, but the intent was entirely different. I wasn't tending to a plant. I was claiming the space. My fingers found the line of her jaw. It was sharp, architectural, the very structure she had defended so fiercely earlier, the bone structure that sold magazines and launched campaigns. But under my touch, the bone wasn't brittle, and it wasn't cold. It was warm. It was alive. I traced the angle from her ear down to her chin, a tactile mapping of the terrain she usually sold but never shared. Her skin was incredibly soft, a shocking, velvety contrast to the hardness of the wall behind her and the rigid tension that had been radiating off her all night. She didn't flinch. That was the most terrifying part for her, I think. The woman who had spent a decade anticipating the angle of a lens, who knew exactly how to turn her face to catch the light, didn't try to curate this moment. She didn't tilt her chin to optimize the shadow. She simply existed. She let my fingers map the geography of her face without trying to change the topography. Structure, I murmured, the word vibrating against the silence, heavy with meaning. You said you were the structure holding it all up. My thumb brushed the corner of her mouth, feeling the slight, rapid intake of her breath. It was a transgression. It was a question asked in a language older than words. It holds, I confirmed, my voice a low rumble. It holds perfectly. Her eyes fluttered closed. The visual input was too much. Or perhaps she just wanted to feel this without the distraction of seeing it happen. When she moved, it wasn't away from me. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift forward. A surrender. She leaned into my palm, pressing her cheek against the roughness of my hand, seeking the friction, seeking the weight. It was the heavy, grounding ballast I had promised her. For a woman used to being handled like a prop, being held like a precious, dangerous thing was a narcotic stronger than the Jasmine. The heat coming off her was radiant. It wasn't just body temperature. It was the caloric burn of adrenaline and suppressed desire finally finding an outlet. The air between us was so thick you could almost chew on it. A cocktail of night-blooming flowers, expensive silk, and the salt of skin. I moved closer. The gap between our bodies closed until I could feel the rise and fall of her chest against mine. Not touching, but close enough to share the static. I tilted her face up. Her eyes opened, dark and blown wide, reflecting nothing but me and the amber shadows of the room. We were on the precipice. The edge of the cliff where gravity takes over and you stop making decisions. I could see the pulse jumping frantically in her throat. I could smell the change in her pheromones, a shift from defensive to inviting, a scent that cut through the sweetness of the flowers like a knife. I lowered my head. The distance shrank to millimeters. I was close enough to taste the air leaving her lips, close enough to cross the line that separates a florist from a lover, a service provider from a partner in crime. It would have been easy. It would have been the natural conclusion to the script we had been writing since she opened the door. To kiss her. To let the tension snap and dissolve into something messy and physical. But that wasn't the lesson. That wasn't the gift. The power wasn't in the release. It was in the suspension. It was in the agonizing, electric hold of the moment right before the touch becomes a grab. I held her there, suspended in the amber light, trapped in the amber of her own desire. The will they, won't they wasn't a question anymore. We both knew we would. We both knew we could. But by not doing it, by letting the air stay charged and unspent, I was giving her something rarer than satisfaction. I was giving her the feeling of being wanted without being consumed. I was letting her feel the hunger without forcing her to feed it. The tension peaked, a high singing note in the silence, vibrating in our teeth, in our bones. It was excruciating. It was perfect. I pulled my hand away. It wasn't a retreat. It was a strategic withdrawal. The loss of contact felt louder than the contact itself, a sudden silence where a shout had been. The cool air of the apartment rushed into the space between us, chilling the skin where my palm had rested against her jaw. She didn't sway, but I saw her eyes lose focus for a fraction of a second, the way a person looks when they step off a moving train onto a stationary platform. The momentum was still there, humming under her skin, but the vehicle had stopped. I stepped back. One step, then two. I was reestablishing the perimeter, rebuilding the safety gap that I had spent the last hour dismantling. It was necessary. To stay would be to consume, and I wasn't here to consume her. I was here to remind her that she could exist without being consumed. The room had transformed. While we were locked in that standoff of breath and bone, the Cestrum Nocturnum had finished its work. The plant was fully ablaze now, every bud thrown wide open, star-shaped throats shouting their scent into the gloom. The smell was thick, almost viscous, coating the back of my throat with honey and heavy green musk.
The sterile architectural void of her apartment was gone. It was a jungle now, humid with intention, smelling of things that happen in the dark. "Listen to me," I said, my voice rougher than I intended, scraping against the velvet heaviness of the air. I nodded toward the plant, using it as the shield once more. "This thing, it's resilient, but it's specific. It doesn't need much, but it needs the right things." She blinked, slowly coming back to herself, though she didn't step out of the shadow of the alcove. She looked at the plant, then back at me, her expression unguarded, stripped clean. "Water it," I instructed, holding her gaze, "but only when the soil is dry. Don't drown it just because you think it needs attention. It likes to be thirsty. It roots deeper when it has to search for what it needs." I saw the recognition in her eyes. She knew I wasn't talking about the Jasmine. She lived her life drowning in attention, flooded with it until her roots had rotted away, leaving her unstable, easily toppled. I was telling her to let herself want, to let the thirst build until it meant something. "And the light," I continued, backing away toward the hallway, moving through the thick, scented air. "Keep it low. If you put it in the spotlight, it will close up. It will refuse to bloom. It needs the shadows to feel safe enough to open. Do you understand?" "I understand," she whispered. The words were barely audible, but they carried the weight of a vow. She wasn't promising to care for the plant. She was acknowledging the permission I had just given her to hide, to step out of the light, to stop performing. I turned away. It was the hardest physical movement I had made all night. Turning my back on that level of raw, unpolished beauty felt like a crime, but it was the only way to leave the tension intact. My boots were heavy on the polished concrete floor, a rhythmic, grounding thud that marked the distance growing between us. I walked past the marble console, past the ghost furniture, toward the door that led back to the ordinary world. At the threshold, I paused. My hand found the cold metal of the lever. I didn't want to look back. Orpheus taught us that looking back destroys the rescue. But I couldn't leave without one final calibration. I turned. She hadn't moved. She was still standing in the alcove, bathed in the amber bleed of the city lights and the shadows we had curated together. But she wasn't a silhouette anymore. She wasn't a flat, two-dimensional cutout against the window. She was solid. She was defined. Her shoulders were down, her hands hung loose at her sides. No posing, no angles, no defense. She was just a woman standing in her own living room, breathing the same heavy air I was leaving behind. "I'll be back," I said, the promise hanging in the air, heavy and undeniable. "I need to check the soil. Next week." She didn't smile. She didn't need to. She just nodded, a microscopic movement that acknowledged the contract. The door was closing, but the loop was open. The latch clicked shut, sealing the heavy, narcotic scent of the Jasmine inside with her. The hallway air felt thin and cheap in my lungs. I walked away, but the weight of her gaze was still pressing against my spine. If you know the terrifying precision of being seen in the dark, subscribe for more.